All right, let's start. So Thursday, Wednesday, we'll have the team competition. You see, our team competitions are essentially exam 2 going forward, so you get some practice. So hopefully y'all did well on the last ones. We don't really need to do that one a second time. So we'll move on the bonds. And then today we'll do stocks. So stocks is a little trickier. So I told you last time, Dr. Damodaran likes to break it up into 2 pieces, the current company and then a growth phase, really 3 pieces. So the current company, a growth phase, and then the steady state. And then you got to find a discount rate, put all those together. We're not going to quite use that approach. I'm going to show you how we'll do the approach, but pretty common for investment bankers to do this. You'll see a lot of videos where they'll do 5 years of forecasts. And so they'll start with last year, which gives them the current. They'll do 5 years of forecast, that allows you to do some growth. And then the 5th year, they'll just take the 5th year and value that as a steady state. Why 5 years? Well, that's just someone picked 5 years. It really should be, you go out until you hit the steady state. What the steady state means is your firm just becomes a normal firm. It's not growing any faster. It's hit its peak. It can't go any further. Where is that going to be? A lot of firms may already be there. If that's the case, then we can use very, very simple valuation techniques of the existing assets, because the existing assets is the firm. There's nothing new coming up. We were looking at Campbell Soup. So what does Campbell Soup own? So they own Campbell Soup. Do they own anything else that you consume? Anybody know? You might be surprised. Campbell's, Goldfish, you know, they had Goldfish. Prego, Swanson, Lance, they own Lance. Pace, you remember when they bought Pace? Wasn't that like a real, no, that's waiting for your time, but how could they buy Pace? I mean, it's like how could a non-Texas company own? You remember the Pace commercials? Y'all are too young.
The New York City ones?
Yeah. Get a rope, you remember that? So they're comparing themselves to those, you know, those ugly Yankees in New York, and it's like, no, you're not gonna sell it. You can only use Pace because it's a good Texas company, and then they got bought out by SpaghettiOs. Bro, I don't think I've ever eaten those in my entire life. Milano, I have eaten that, but there's a lot of things going on here. Is there anything in there that's growing incredibly fast? I mean, that looks really good, doesn't it? Don't you want to have that for lunch now? That looks really good. Hot soup with goldfish in it. I've never tried that before, but it looks pretty good. But there's nothing here particularly growing fast. And all of these have heavy competition. They have heavy competition from, you know, the Kellogg's and General Mills, but they also have heavy competition from Walmart and H-E-B and their store brands. How did Campbell Soup do in 2020, do you think? Good year, bad year? But when you're a family with 3 kids, Campbell Soup's a pretty good option, isn't it? It's about as easy as you can get it. You get one of those tomato soup cans, and you can feed, if you've been feeding your kids 5 days a week at the school, and now suddenly you're going to have to feed them at home. So they had a great 2020. Now they're back down. So how do you value a firm like this? I don't see anything that's particularly high growth. They could have high growth overseas. They grow in, you know, some emerging countries. They could certainly do that. It's certainly an impressive firm. You've all heard of them. You probably have eaten, I doubt, you know, probably more than 20% of this class has never eaten one of their products, and it's possible 100% of this class has eaten at least one of their products. So, but where's the growth coming from? You know, it's a company that may be at that the steady state and the existing assets is one and the same, because they are where they are. And so you spend a lot of time on this middle section. This middle section can be really, really, really tough. You're looking at a firm like Alphabet or Google. You know, what are they doing? they got all these ideas going on. It's pretty incredible. Or Meta with their visual reality and virtual reality, and they have these other things going on that are kind of interesting. So it can be really, really tough to figure out this particular growth. I was listening to business breakdowns, which again I highly recommend. The day I did their DoorDash one, I was tempted at DoorDash. I bought Uber stock, and that worked out really, really well. But my thought on Uber was, this is just a really, really cheap stock. But DoorDash has always looked really expensive to me. So where's DoorDash's growth going to come from? Do y'all use DoorDash? I don't remember their ticker. So this is a firm that's not making money. So how can they make money? So I was looking at that podcast today. The guy said, I'm really excited to come talk to you about this firm because I'm really excited about them, really great company. And then he spends the 45 minutes essentially saying, yeah, they have no hope of ever becoming profitable. It's like, okay, that doesn't sound all exciting. I said, no, but they're an incredible firm. My word, look at those revenue, look at that revenue growth. Yeah, that's impressive revenue growth, especially 2020. You're right. You expect them to have done really, really well. But look at that, even after 2020, they continue to have this incredible growth. But what's wrong with this company? So if he was saying $100 tab and a restaurant's going to pay DoorDash $25, does that make sense for the restaurant? Are restaurants just rolling in money that they can pay 25% of their revenue, not of their profits, 25% of their profit revenue to DoorDash? And in DoorDash, New York minimum wage now is $24. You can do 2 DoorDash in an hour. So they got to pay 12 of that 25 to the drivers. But that's on a $100 ticket. On a $30 ticket, that's like $6. So on a $30 ticket, they're losing money just paying the drivers. How do they get around their drivers? They don't actually pay their drivers $24, do they? They take the tips and they offset the tips. But when I'm listening to this, I'm like, I mean, it's exciting what they're doing. They're growing really fast. Their revenues are growing. What else is growing? Their losses. So that's not good. So how's DoorDash? So now they're delivering groceries. Well, they're losing money on groceries and actually barely making money in restaurants. What else are they going to do? You talked about them delivering Christmas trees. Yeah, that's a higher price item. Does it really make sense for your Christmas tree to come by DoorDash? That seems to kill the whole tradition, doesn't it? Yeah, I don't know. It just seems kind of strange. So I don't know. They're trying other things, but groceries is a really loser. Why is grocery a loser? Because groceries don't make much money, so they don't have much room to pay. So now they're talking about them. Well, they're going to have these ghost kitchens. They're going to start doing some Amazon stuff, or they're going to go look and see what's the main things that 7-Eleven and Corner Store are selling, and we'll just have these warehouses. We'll have all that stuff, and we'll just get the margin ourselves. That doesn't sound like a DoorDash, does it? What's DoorDash's whole model? It's asset light. An asset light company is going to suddenly have all these assets. It doesn't make sense. I've heard that same argument with Uber. That Uber is going to convert from rideshare to autonomous vehicles. But does that make sense? What is Uber's big model? No assets, right? They're drivers on the assets. And then they go from an asset light model to an asset heavy model. So that's what we're looking for. And it's getting really tough, isn't it? If autonomous vehicles come along, that's going to have a pretty huge impact on Uber's business. And how are they going to actually get around it? Are they going to actually buy the vehicles? Or are you going to buy vehicles and you're going to lease them out to Uber and use Uber software? That might make sense, right? You might buy an autonomous vehicle and it might just be driving all day long. You don't. So who knows what's going to happen here? Same thing with Airbnb. You know, these type of models, what's Airbnb's growth story? They need more people with real estate selling their real estate, but then they start competing with themselves, you know. So it's tough. It's very, very hard to forecast these businesses. Campbell Soup is probably pretty simple. to do. Costco's pretty simple to do because they have a fairly specific plan on how many stores they're going to add every year, and you can use that and project it out. But it's tough. This is the reason for you as a finance major to be listening to that business breakdown. One thing they do really well there is, and they did it for DoorDash when I was listening to them today, is give me the dynamics on one drive, one delivery. He said, well, I'll do a $30 delivery and I'll do a $100 delivery. Very, very different. What about Amazon Prime? Are they making money on Amazon Prime? That looks like a loser, doesn't it? How much does Amazon Prime? I don't even know. I'm part of Amazon Prime. How much does it cost? I can't remember. Is it like $16 a month? Something. I can't remember something. But I think of all the deliveries I get every month, I'm doing pretty well on that particular one, and it's pretty cool. I'm getting all those deliveries for this fixed fee. But Amazon Prime, are they making money on Amazon Prime? Amazon does not make that much money if you take AWS away from it. It's not a particularly profitable business. So it's tough. That's why it's frustrating to do stocks, but it's also pretty exciting because if you can find some edge that helps you understand these businesses. But the hardest thing about valuing a stock is the forecasting. You've got to forecast out the next 100 years. You don't have to do that with bonds. With bonds, what do you have to do? You just got to figure out if they're going to default or not. If they don't default, it's pretty easy. Your cash flow is in the contract. It's a piece of cake. With stocks, much, much more difficult. And so he has, and this is kind of good old Damodaran. I stole this from one of his presentations. So the magnitude is going to be the function is going to be, I mean, the value of the firm is going to be magnitude of expected cash flows on the asset over its lifetime and uncertainty. So that's where your discount rate come in. If it doesn't affect cash flows, it doesn't affect value. That's from a finance standpoint. You can talk about ESG all you want. He's going to say if ESG doesn't affect cash flow, it doesn't affect value. Now, could ESG affect value? Well, if you have ESG investors, what are they going to do? They're going to over demand good ESG companies, so their stock price may go up. But if they don't ultimately get some benefit out of that, the stock price is going to come back down. The DA factor for an asset to have value, its expected cash flows have to be positive at some point. At some point, DoorDash has to start making money. You can talk about how wonderful the revenues are growing, but if they're not scalable, and by me scalable, what that means is when their revenues grow 10%, their earnings grow 50%. So they've got economies of scale. Or for DoorDash, I mean, that's what's so frustrating with DoorDash is their revenues are growing really fast, or so are their losses. You want at some point, now Amazon was like that too. It wasn't that long ago, where Amazon's revenues are growing fast and they had losses. And then finally they switched and they started having gains, and then the gains started growing really fast. So that's what you have to think through with these companies. Now, I know GameStop finally had positive earnings this last time. That's why I gave them to you. But it wasn't much, and we don't know how sustainable that is. I don't know which company y'all doing for paper two. If you can't find one you're interested in, I mean, you've got to, you know, it's not a hard paper to do sitting in Bloomberg. So Lululemon just came out. Lululemon's was pretty interesting earnings report. So any of y'all are interested in them, you know, I can add other companies if you want me to. Email me and I'll get you the data. But Lululemon was really, really quite interesting. So, you know, these are firms, they're interesting firms, but they gotta eventually make a positive cash flow. I was worried about Netflix there for a while. They were positive cash flow, and then they started to do their own production, and these productions were $1 billion or more. You suddenly started noticing them going from positive cash flow to negative cash flow. And how are they going to get that money back? More subscribers, but how many more subscribers are going to get when you have Disney and Hulu and other people, you know, even Apple and I don't know, does Amazon have an online TV thing too? I don't know. What are y'all using actually? This would be good investment research. How many of y'all are Netflix? Is that most of y'all? Who's absolutely not Netflix? 2 or 3, both. Any Hulus in here? Anybody Hulu and Netflix? Yeah, both. I was flipping between the two as I got bored, and now I'm neither one of them. Anybody subscribe to YouTube? Do you actually pay YouTube?
YouTube TV, which is like their cable service. So yeah,
Okay.
it's not quite easy.
Do you know if it's as good as Netflix? Have you noticed?
Well,
Or
YouTube is like live TV, but it's like
Oh.
cancel it and you can record anything. So it's like you get basically all the stuff.
that's why I love Hulu and Netflix is the cancel anytime. They make that really convenient, which is kind of the negative side on that. I don't know how Disney is. Obviously, Disney is really struggling right now. The streaming service is not making money. Maybe that's good news for Netflix. They're all going to have to raise the rates. Now, Netflix has talked about an advertising function, didn't they? I forget how much that's, so they're all trying, they're all competing. But Netflix can't spend $1 billion on new programming if they're not going to get $1 billion in new revenue to offset it. And then don't freak out, assets that generate cash flows early in their life will be worth more than assets that generate, there is a time value of money to this. And that's why we talk about growth stocks. Growth stocks are those where a lot of that cash flow is way out into the future. So they're much more volatile, much more sensitive to small changes in your assumptions. All right, so let's talk about, so we're in the papers 3 and 4. So paper 4, the hardest thing on paper 4 is coming up with the growth rate. How fast are the earnings going to grow for your company? So think back with Dan Darren. You can talk about the growth rate of existing assets, the growth rate of the new stuff they're doing, and then the ultimate growth rate when they get to wherever they're going. All right, so you kind of have 3 growth rates. We're not going to have 3 growth rates. We're going to have 2, kind of where they are growing today and where they're ultimately going to grow when they get to that steady state at the end. So the steady state at the end, I would say you get to the U.S. economic growth. And even less than that. So no firm is going to grow 20% forever and ever and ever. So eventually you get to where you're going and you just stop. And one reason you think about Apple, a $2.5 trillion company, it's just, they do the iPad, they do the Mac, they do the iPad, they do the iPhone. Eventually everybody has that product. You can't grow anymore. So then you say, well, now we'll do the Apple Watch. Well, that's fine. You're going to do the Apple Watch and it might grow 30, 40%, but it's a small part of your business. And so you've got everything else going on that's just kind of dead. That new product isn't going to grow so rapidly. And once it gets so big, that new product is just not going to be big enough to really dent your growth rates. You just can't do much. What is Apple going to do next? What's the next big product for Apple? They're running out of ideas. It used to be pretty exciting when the new iPhone came out. Now you're kind of like, how are they going to hype up, camera with a few more pixels? What else can they do? You're kind of getting bored with the release, and it's not their fault. They just, you just can't grow that fast. Now Google right now is real nervous. Why is Google struggling? They're worried about ChatGPT. How's that going to affect them? How's Microsoft going to affect them? It's getting interesting. So ultimately, your firm is ultimately going to grow somewhere around where the U.S. economy grows. And I even think it might just be population growth plus inflation. We talked about that a little earlier. Once you get out there, if you're Walmart, you got a store everywhere you can have a store. At that point, your growth is going to be population plus inflation. That's about all you can do. When that's not much cost, population growth around the world is actually shrinking. So, at some point you may just be getting inflation. We'll talk about that when we value some firms using inflation as our rate. We talked about this earlier, right? Productivity, 1.5%, 2.5%, maybe go to 3 if you're really excited about something, but it's going to be tough to get productivity much higher than that. Labor growth, that's kind of like the same thing with population growth. We're kind of getting to a steady state. We don't know what AI is going to do to that. Inflation is whatever it is. That one's kind of a wash, kind of offset each other. Your inflation rate and your discount rate somewhat offset each other. So I think the U.S. economy can grow in the 4 to 6% range. And everybody's excited about China growing 7% this year. But it used to be for China, 7 was a mediocre number. Now 7 is a good number for China. And where's China getting its growth? Again, it's coming from productivity. And they still have a lot of productivity you can gain. They can still add a lot more capital to their country. I think their per capita is getting close to around $10,000. And that's productivity. That's going to rise with productivity. So could your global growth be higher than that? Yeah, but eventually China is not going to grow much faster than 3 to 4%. It's just the nature of the world. So that's some of your baseline. Ultimately, every stock's going to grow in that 4 to 6% range and just go out of business. You just can't grow much faster than that. Can you think about the industry that you are in? Is this a above average fast growing industry or below? So here's where, well, let's talk about some of these things. I don't know how many of these you know. So I'm assuming you've all had Porter's 5 courses. Does that sound right? Can y'all name them? I've seen this graphic. So buyer and suppliers, those are probably 2 most critical ones.
Thread substitution.
Thread substitution. You got 1, 2. So thread new entrants and then rivalry within the industries. So Porter's is very heavily used. I would know Porter's. I've learned Porter's in my graduate school, and then suddenly just hear all the time in finance. It's quite common. So Porter's is a good one because what the purpose of Porter's is to tell you the strength of an industry, and what it really does mean is the growth in that industry. It really is a growth thing. So if you have really strong suppliers, that's going to reduce the growth of the industry because they're going to control what you can do. That's some of the risks people are talking about with electronic vehicles. They need a whole lot of these precious earth things. They need a lot of copper. They need, what's that thing from Congo? I can't remember, but but lithium and all this kind of stuff they're going to need. I'm not an expert on EVs. Cobalt. Yeah. So they need this stuff. Or they find substitutes for these things. But yeah, there's certainly issues with the supplier side, the buyer power. How much bargaining power do the buyers have? They're going to control the growth of the industry. The industry is not going to be able to take control. Threat of substitutes, you got to be real careful there. A lot of people get mixed up between substitutes and competition. We're not talking about the threat of substitute of Family Dollar doing something the Dollar General. We're talking about something radically new. So substitute would be somewhat I talk with DoorDash. Is instead of having restaurants, they have these ghost kitchens and you just order everything from the ghost kitchen. That would be a substitute for restaurants. Instead of going to a restaurant, you know, the restaurant is essentially just a bunch of kitchens with no seating and a bunch of DoorDash people are lined up to pick up your order and go deliver it to you. That would be a substitution threat. Cannabis would be a substitution threat for alcohol. Right. What would happen? I don't know. I don't drink alcohol. I don't use cannabis. I don't smoke cigarettes. I don't know all the fun stuff. I've avoided them all. Threats of new entrants. That's where that economies of scale come in. And then how much rivalry is there in the industry? That's the one thing I worry about with Netflix and Disney. There's so much rivalry going on right now. That's gonna you don't want an industry that's just fighting for market share. Fortunately, that market's probably still growing, but I don't know how much more growth they can have. You got to get a lot more bandwidth in some emerging countries to really let it grow faster. But it's a great model. And then you have is generic strategies, which I think is really helpful. So he talks about the cost leaders and the differentiators, and then the focus. And you remember that? I would know this stuff off the top of your head because we use it all the time. So as you think about your industry, does your industry have a cost leader? Who's the cost leader for airlines, not in the United States, but globally? Have y'all flown this British airline. There's a great business breakdown on this industry. So Ryanair, have y'all heard of Ryanair? Anybody here flown Ryanair? Have you? Did it feel like a cheap airline? Did it? Kind of like a Spirit airline, kind of? But man, they have some great numbers. It's incredibly. And they did somewhat like Southwest did and Spirit has been doing is they make fun of themselves in their advertising. That's the way they handle themselves with the bad press. So they're definitely the cost leader. And then when you have a cost leader, you want to know what is the cost advantage? How much cheaper are they than everybody else? And then you have the differentiators. What do we know about differentiators? Well, almost always, if not always, costs money to differentiate. So how much does it cost them to differentiate themselves? So if you're looking at a company on papers 3 and 4, you got a firm that is a differentiator. What is that differentiation? So with Netflix, that might be that original programming. That's pretty cool. I mean, Disney has its original programming, but they're just streaming it. They've always had it. They're just streaming it. I don't know if Disney's creating new stuff just for streaming, but Netflix has been very, very impressive. And some of the stuff that I haven't watched any of it, but I'm sure it's really, really good. That gives them an edge. That gives them an advantage, but that stuff is extremely expensive. It's not like they just, hey, let's spend $10 and create this whole new program. So extremely expensive. So then you got to figure out how much the differentiation costs versus how much extra revenue is that giving us. If you're spending extra $10 to differentiate, you're getting extra $6 in revenue, you're wasting your money. So you need to think that's another reason I love business breakdown. They go into that. How much more is a Peloton than Nautilus? I have no idea. I don't have exercise equipment in my house either. And how much better is Peloton versus Nautilus and the software and all that kind of stuff? You're trying to figure that out. And then the focus ones, either focus costs or focus differentiator, they're taking some target market and they're making sure to appeal to that particular market. Again, Porter, really good stuff. Another one I just found was Helmer's 7 Powers. I just read his book. It was an okay book. It's not going to be on my reading list. It was an okay book. A lot of overlap with Porter's, no question. I'm trying to find a good summary. So scale economies is a one-to-one match for Porter. So he talks about scale economies. You talk about the network economics. That's not necessarily in Porter's, but the network is part of that kind of that scale advantage. Network economies is more customers gives both you and your customers advantage. So network would be like Netflix or like Facebook, something where more customers, they eat off of each other. Uber is a good example of a network economies. If you're going to start a new rideshare, you need drivers. How do you get drivers? Well, you have to have riders. How do you get riders? You have to have drivers. It's this circular loop. Uber has figured out how to go into a new city, get drivers really fast because they have a reputation, right? You'd have a tough time starting rideshare in San Antonio just on your own. But if you're Uber and they come into a new city, people have heard of them. They're going to get drivers. It works at that network effect that they have. Restaurants are not network economies. What happens when a restaurant gets really popular? You got an hour and a half wait time. What does that do? That hurts your customer, So a business where more customers makes the experience worse is the opposite of a network thing. Theme parks is the ultimate. I knew USAA was doomed when they did Fiesta Texas because they opened it up free for all USAA employees. I went. It was miserable. You're waiting in line 3 hours for the Rattler. And we get back and the people from the real estate company says, yeah, we need to average that every day to make money. I'm thinking, first of all, you're not going to get that Monday through Friday. Secondly, if you have that every day, people are going to stop coming because it was absolutely miserable. And that's the problem with theme parks. You got to pack the place out to make money. And when you pack it out, no one has any fun. It's a horrible business, but that's not the case for a network economy. So you're dealing with a company that has a network effect. Counter positioning was really, here's one thing. This is one thing we really added. Very similar to another thing you should know, which is Christensen. Have y'all heard of him? I do highly recommend his books. Y'all heard of Christensen and Disruptive Innovations? Another good tool. I'm not saying you're going to use all of these in your paper form, but these are all tools that are really effective, helping you figure out the growth of a company. So disruptive innovation and counter positioning. This is when a business comes in and they do something new and unusual, and the existing firms don't want to touch it because it's going to destroy their own business. So it could be Netflix coming in and starting to do streaming. It could be probably the best example I remember from Christensen. I thought it was really interesting was him talking about Western Union. So Western Union had this wonderful business of telegraph. We may have talked about this in this class, but it's a good example of telegraph business. And Alexander Bell comes to Western Union and say, have this new invention. What do you think about it? And they say, well, no one's going to want to talk on this thing. Why would any man want to sit around talking on this telephone thing? That doesn't make sense. And people say, how stupid can they be? But if you actually look at it, Christensen says the decision they made perfect sense. They had a huge capital investment in telegraph. They had huge contracts on telegraph. Telephone was going to disrupt that. And they were like, no, we got to stick with what we're doing. That's where we're making money. And that's what he's saying is the existing player can't go into that business because it destroys this great margin business they already have. And that's how you counter positioning. I forget the example he gives. He gives a really good one in there. I mean, he gives Vanguard. Vanguard came in with index, really cheap investing. And what did Fidelity say? Oh, how stupid, no one's going to do that. That's mediocrity. Why would anybody want mediocrity? Well, what is Fidelity really saying? Hey, we're making 100 basis points on our active management. Why would we want to make 10 basis points on indexing? That's that counter positioning. What did Vanguard do? They came in, they won. Fidelity eventually had to jump on, but they lost a lot of business in the process. This one's pretty critical. Switching costs, that's part of Porter's. You'll see that under buyer power. Switching costs is what? It's really hard for the customer to switch to another provider because it's just too much training, too much catching up. So that's part of Porter's, but he has it a separate one. Branding is part of Porter's. That's part of the entry barrier. Branding is an entry barrier. And that's the other thing you'll find here is an overlap with economic moats. Have y'all heard that one? Switching costs, network effect, those are economic moats. So you should know all of these. They should all be part of your nomenclature. So branding, he talks about Tiffany's as his branding. I've never bought anything from Tiffany's. I don't know how good that is, but certainly Tiffany's. I think you can buy a Tiffany box online for like $100 and put something from Walmart in it. And corner resource is kind of a strange one. He talks there about Pixar. Just having these people at Pixar who are just so gifted, so talented. You can say, well, but someone else could get them, but if someone else got them, they have to pay a really high price. But Pixar had them for a low price because they were starting this new firm and they came in and just took over the world. So yeah, Pixar is his example there. And then power process power. So you have some process that gives you huge advantage. He uses Toyota as his example on that. So why is this so important? So the real key here, we're talking about growth. If I tell you I got this firm that's growing really fast, doing extremely well, making a lot of money, the first thing you can come to mind as a finance person is what? Competition. So what are we talking about with Porter's, generic strategy, Helmer, economic moats? We're talking about competitive sustainable advantage. Something that allows this company to grow faster for a longer period of time because they have some advantage. That's what Helmer's talking about. That's what Porter's talking about. Can an industry grow faster than everybody else? Well, if they have entry barriers, they can. Because if other firms can't come in, that protects them from the competition. So that's really, really huge. Sustainable competitive advantage. It can be at the company level, it can be at the industry level. It's something that allows a firm to grow fast for a longer than expected period of time because they have these protections. Your economics class said that shouldn't happen. If a firm's making above cost of capital returns, you know, if their cost of capital is 8%, they're making 12, it should bring in competition. It should kill that. Their prices should fall, their margins should shrink. But if firms have something that protects them from all of that, that's what you're looking for. Another good tool to use that hopefully you've seen in your classes is value chain. Who created the value chain? You may know. Who's used value chain in here? Y'all done that in your classes? No one's had value chain at all. Maybe in a marketing class or in a strategy class. Y'all think strategy, management strategy? Probably in your management class. So you had at least 3 hours of management, didn't you? Anybody know who created value chain? Porter. Pretty impressive guy. All right. I use Porter in my health insurance class, my life insurance class, because he's disrupting that industry. So value chains, I would definitely know the value chain. This is the traditional way you see it. This picture right here. Here's a few of these things that I would probably put on a piece of paper and carry in my wallet or in my pocket. These are just things you should know. So value chains, very, very critical, very helpful for paper 4. It has a lot to do with this sustainable competitive advantage. What you're asking is, where does a firm shine in this value chain? So you got the inbound, that's your raw materials coming in, it's your workers, whatever it is. You have your operations, you're making something, you're building something, you're producing something, you have software. You have your outbound, which that's getting the stuff to the customer. You have your marketing. Then after you sell, you have the service. Where does your firm excel on that? That's why I recommended the HelloFresh podcast from Business Breakdown. He talks about the value chain, and he says their goal is to be number 1 on every single one of these. Because his argument is, he uses the Olympic argument. You have an Olympic athlete and they pull one muscle, and how are they going to do in the Olympics? They're done for. And that's what he said. You got to be Olympic of every single one of these things. You got to be top in class. And that's what he says at HelloFresh. Any of y'all use HelloFresh? I've never tried it. I don't like it at all. The business model doesn't make sense to me, but I love the fact that the CEO of this company is saying, we're going to be top notch in every single part of our business, which means he has to understand every single part of his business and know where the weak spots are and fix those weak spots. And I think that's the issue with DoorDash is getting this to work so that it can actually make money. So what does your firm do? So we can get the paper 4. What does your firm do where they're especially strong? So with Walmart, it might be, that's the other part of this, is supply chain management. That's part of the value chain management. But my guess is Walmart is extremely good on supply chain management. Now, I don't know about HEB. If I were working for HEB, supply chain management is where I'd focus my attention, because that's the most complicated part of HEB is supply chain management. Now, someone said it's real estate. Maybe it is a real estate piece, but that's what you want to understand. Is HEB great because of supply chain management or because of real estate management? Which of the two is it? Or is it both? I'm really strong in both of those. And then that's going to affect your margins, obviously, your technology, your procurement, your human resources, all that infrastructure, your accounting, finance, all that kind of stuff. You've got to you got to figure out where does the firm excel here. So that case of Ryanair, what I thought interesting is Ryanair is they got to be cheap. So they're a lot like Southwest. One of the things that you hear that Southwest used to do was only buy one plane. I think gives you huge advantages for training pilots, for maintenance. But they said Ryanair also waits until Boeing's having a really horrible year and then they go buy 1,000 planes so they can get them on the cheap. Well, if you're going to be the cheapest in the industry, yeah, you're going to do everything cheap. I think I saw one they took the olives off of their meal, and someone added up how much olives weigh and how much fuel that was going to cost. Is that getting pretty cheap? Now I'm sure Ryanair doesn't provide meals. When's the last time you had a meal on a plane? It doesn't happen very often, doesn't it anymore? But that's what the cheapest in the industry. So that's really key. I think that's where Porter's coming in. If your firm's main thing is they're going to be the cheapest in the industry, so they're going to control costs, then that's going to really affect how you assess the supply chain management. If you're Tiffany's, then it's going to be the marketing and sales, the outbound, the service. It's going to be these kind of things that you're going to really focus in. I remember with Lexus had a problem with one of their new cars. They're going to have to do some recall. And they decided, you know, we're going to do recall. How can we do this recall so we create a great experience for our customer? How can we do something special? So they're almost hoping to come in, get the car worked on because it's going to be such a great experience. We're going to give them a great rental car or whatever. It's going to cost us some money, but we're actually going to take advantage of it because now they're thinking about us. So they're thinking about us. We're going to make it a great experience. Why? Because that's what they do. They're on that differentiation side, so they're willing to spend money. Ryanair would never do that. Ryanair lost your luggage. What do we care? You're riding on Ryanair. There's obviously you had cheap bags and you had nothing good in it. You know, that's what they think of me if I go on Spirit Airlines, right? I'm a cheapie. So you lost your luggage, big deal. You didn't lose anything of importance. So Porter is giving you some great tools to think about companies, and they're really quite powerful. You don't necessarily have to pick all of them, but I would start working this kind of stuff into your papers because it's really critical stuff. You might say, I'm not supposed to do this because I didn't learn this in a finance class. Well, surprise, surprise, we use this stuff in finance. I hear Porters all the time. We used to interview firms. We interviewed hundreds of firms a year. Porters came up all the time. Very, very popular approach. One thing about Helmer, I've been listening to the business breakdown, and Helmer has now come up in 2 of the last 4 podcasts I've listened to. I never heard of Helmer. Have y'all heard of Helmer's in your, sounds like a mayonnaise, but it's an author. Have you heard Helmer's in your classes? Anybody? I've never heard of him before. Yeah, I heard his podcast. Yeah, I'm using Helmer's 7 Powers now. And I go, oh, I've never heard of that. And then just today, Helmer's 7 Powers. And they really love his counter positioning. That one comes up a lot as a really good way of thinking about a firm. And part of this is the storytelling, and that's what they offer to you as a way to tell the story of your company in very intelligent, logical ways to really break down. There's probably some other ones out there, but Porter's 5 Fortes, let me just type them out here. So how many of these have you heard of them? Porter's 5 Forces. Porter's generic strategies. Helmer's 7 Powers. Christensen, disruptive innovation. Porter's value chain analysis. You also have supply chain analysis, which is just a sub. How many of these have you heard of before? So you've all heard of Porter's. Doesn't sound like any of y'all have heard of Christensen. You really should read Christensen's books. They're really quite good. They're old. They're still very, very good. Porter, you can get Porter's books, boy, they're thick. And they're tough. I would view Porter's books more as a reference book than as something I would read. He was really tough for me to read riding my bike. Because what he does is he likes to give examples and go deep into those examples. So he'll pick one company or one industry and he'll just spend a lot of time talking about them. If you were doing an analysis of that company, that would be really valuable to actually go to that and see what he's talking about, because he goes into it goes so deep into it that it really, really helps you a lot. And that's true with his 5 forces, it's true of his value chain management. Christensen, what he does in his, I think it's called Seeing What's Next. This book right here, I do reckon this book is quite old, probably 20 years old or something. I don't know when it was published. 2004. So yeah, it's almost 20 years old. But what he does, the first few chapters, he explains a theory, and it's a really good theory. The one thing I don't like about the book, he has these charts that make no sense to me at all. It's just, so I ignore the charts, but the book itself is very readable. And then after introducing that, he then, I want to see inside, but it won't let me do that. He then takes industry by industry by industry and walks through exactly how disruptive innovation works there. Disruptive innovation is extremely important. That's why Blockbuster went out of business. They didn't see the streaming coming on, and they didn't react in time. That's the reason Kodak is out of business. I was talking about Kodak in the beginning of my risk class. People ask, what could Kodak have done differently to save the firm? And I think the answer is nothing. They were done for. There is nothing they could do. They can't suddenly become competitive in digital. It's such a radically, their thing is film. So, they were done for. And that's what Christensen's, and wouldn't that be important to you as a finance person, valuing firms, to see that disruptive innovation coming? If something's going to radically, so what is AI going to change? Google's obviously very worried about AI changing their business model dramatically. What is autonomous vehicles going to do? What's the electronic vehicle going to do? What can Valero do to protect themselves from that? Some of this stuff's not hard to see coming. Obviously, electronic vehicles, Valero's probably been talking about that for 15 years. Can they do anything, or are they just going to go out of business and shut down or become much smaller? UTSA with autonomous vehicles, or they just go out of business? How do you handle these type of risks? And I'm not sure the solution is you change the business. Could Toys R Us have done something to save that business? I don't know if any of y'all have ever been in a Toys R Us. It's a pretty cool place, unless you don't like kids like me. I don't like kids, so it's a horrible place for me. But if you're a parent, it's like, oh, they'd let your kids run all over the place and no one cared. And your kids loved it, and then you went home and bought everything on Amazon, and you're done for the day. You had like free babysitting there. Could Toys R Us have something? Well, yeah, Toys R Us should have gone online. But could Toys R Us really compete with Amazon? Does that make sense? Is that they're going to change their business, so they're going to suddenly hire all these IT people? So I do think there's some business that are just done for. That's what he's talking about.
Remember Circuit City? Like, I think that was Best Buy, right? That was its competitor or something like that.
Yeah, there's certainly, and the interesting with Circuit City is just a few years before that, they were on the front of Business Week as one of the best performing firms out there. So it can happen fast. I think with Blockbuster, when it become obvious they were done for? Can Blockbuster start streaming and really compete with Netflix? What did Netflix do to make sure Blockbuster couldn't do that? That's the kind of thing that Christensen's talking about. And what I love about his theory, he tells you, here's what you got to look for. And one of the things he says is kind of an obvious thing is you hear a major firm talking about their core competencies. We're gonna, Walmart saying, we're gonna let Dollar General have that business. We're gonna focus on our core business. What are they saying? We're losing that. We're not gonna fight for it because we can't win that battle. Well, that's someone now getting into their camp. And that's disruptive. But he also talks about when the disruptor messes up. Can you challenge Walmart? He says, yes, you can, but you better do it in a way that they don't notice it because they're going to take you out. They're too big. So it's not just protecting the blockbusters, but it's also how do you become the next Netflix? I still think it's amazing Netflix is called Netflix because they weren't selling anything on the net when they started. So they saw what was coming next already. All right, so there's just a lot of things. Have any others we should add to the list? So we're talking about ways to think about sustainable high growth. For some reason, my font size changed. This can be at the industry level or at the company level. Ways to think about growth that can sustain above some average amount, not forever, but for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And these are the models. So can anybody think of other models that you've had in your classes? Hopefully you didn't do like I did. Okay, I learned that. I can forget that now. I'm a finance major. I don't need that. That was marketing. Just this is stuff. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you a way to think about the problem, which actually in finance is 90% of the problem. You got to think about how to get into the company. Well, if y'all think of one, let me know. But these are the ones I think you should all know extremely well. I am adding this one to the list just because you've got a couple of really good ones in there. Oh, I left out one. What did I leave out? Like moat. There's good Warren Buffett. There's a high overlap with economic moat and Porter's, but there's some unique things in economic moats. I think between Porter's and Helmer's and economic moats, there's a lot of overlap, but they pretty much cover each other's stuff. So figure out your industry. Is your industry above average? But you got to put the time element to it. They're above average. How long can they sustain that? Above average growth. And that's where the moat comes in. What is it that's protecting them? You're always talking about competition. What is it that's protecting them from competition? One of the business breakdowns I really loved was the Cinnabon. I've talked about that before, but they had the CEO of Cinnabon or the former CEO, and she nailed her company. She understands her company extremely well. And one of the things she understood is, how do I keep Cinnabon from becoming a commodity? Because once we become a commodity, we're done for. We've got to have that margin that is so important. And she described her business so well. She said, if you're going to be bad, make it good. She understood we're not going to make a healthy product. We're making an unhealthy product people are going to indulge in every once in a while when you're in the airport. That's kind of my theory. If my plane is delayed, calories no longer count. That's always been my theory. I'm going to eat whatever I want to eat because I hate airports so much. And there you have, I've never eaten a Cinnabon. I can't imagine eating a Cinnabon and getting on the plane. I think that'd be a pretty horrible experience with the sugar high. But, I understand what she's saying. And she understood that there were certain things they thought about doing that she saw that's going to overly commoditize our business. So we got to be really careful with that. So she understood our business. Some other comment. All right. And then you get down to the company side, and that's where you have the market share implications. Is the company growing because the industry growing, or are they growing because they're taking over market share from other players? So with Netflix, it's both. The business itself is growing. There's more people, doing streaming and watching TV shows, but also they're taking over from Blockbuster It's both together. In fact, they're taking over from Blockbuster even more than it's streaming because of the mail. I actually did the Netflix mail the CD to your home kind of thing. Now it seems ridiculous. It seems like, man, that was 100 years ago. But there's some of both of that. But which is it? So for Disney streaming, is that a new market or is that taking over an existing market? Probably a little bit of both. Are they taking business away from Netflix? You know, what's the most important number Netflix reports every quarter? It's their number of users, right? It's the people that are actually subscribing. So does your company have a moat, brand identity, some platform advantage, a patent, something that protects them from competition? Don't give me in paper 4 a 9-10% growth rate for 20 years without explaining how they're able to maintain that. No company grows 20% without competition wanting to somehow take over that business. Now, how did Cinnabon do it? Well, Cinnabon started off in airports. They were really lucky that their first site, the oven was in front. That wasn't their plan. Their second site, the oven was in back, and they discovered they didn't sell as much. And then like ding, ding, ding. Smell is a big part of our brand. And then they became this franchise business. And then they call up Burger King and they say, what if we sell Cinnabon and Burger King? Well, wait a minute, that's a radical shift. Cinnabon saying we can't lose control of our product. Can we do this in a way where we keep control of the product, but we also open up a new avenue for ourselves? You can see why they were so cautious about that. And then General Mills shows up and says, hey, we want to do a Cinnabon in the stores. CPG, what is CPG? Remember that term? I didn't know that term until just recently, but they use it on consumer packaged goods. So when Cinnabon decides they weren't in consumer packaged goods, they were selling a fresh product right out of the oven. Now they're going to do a packaged good. Can they do that without destroying their brand? And she has, I don't know if y'all have listened to, I really recommend that. She has some great one-liners. She says some stuff on there you could put on a t-shirt. And she knew how to explain things so well. And she goes through that whole process. Should we really do this? Does it make sense for what we're trying to do? Because we got these franchisers. If we do this, become a commodity, we're going to destroy our franchisers. And so the licensing side is how she found out how to grow her business, but she had to be really careful on the licensing, not to destroy something else. Very, very great insights. All right. So when you're picking your company, I realize you're working on paper too, but when you're picking your company for 3 and 4, you might think about these things, give yourself something really meaty to talk about. Something really pretty fascinating to talk about. We'll talk about when we get more into paper 3, the kind of companies you probably want to look at. But there's some companies that are more interesting to talk about than others, no doubt. Now, getting that growth rate for your company for the short term can be really tough. I'm going to give you 3 things you can do, but ultimately it's a forecast. And when it's a forecast, there is nothing I can give you that you just go do. All right, this isn't accounting. I can't tell you how to do accounting for revenue for Boeing. There's rules, so you can follow all the rules. When it comes to forecasting, there are no rules. There's approaches, there's a way of thinking about it, but every forecast is different, and we're horrible at forecasting, so there's no one out there to help you with forecasting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 things you can look at. These 3 things are simply some gee whiz numbers to say, hey, here's a number. Is that a number that makes sense for my company? All right. So the first approach is let's just look at historical growth. How have they been growing in the past? I'll give you some examples of those as we get, I don't want to do that now. All right, so what you can do, here's a good place to use Capital IQ, is just bring in their historical earnings per share and just calculate 3 and 5, 10-year growth rates and just see what have they been growing. And you can take a firm like Campbell Soup. They had that great growth in 2020. Are you going to take that out and look at the longer term? Maybe look at their 3 and 5 and 10-year growth through 2019, and then look at it to current and see how much COVID affected them. We know Costco and Walmart had great growth because of COVID. Have they passed that now, or is that still in the numbers that you need to somewhat adjust for that? So you got to be careful that you don't have some kind of exaggerated number going on. I mean, obviously, the most obvious example. We have Yahoo Finance. Here we have mRNA. Y'all heard of that firm, right? So their earnings per share went from negative $1.55, negative $1.96, $30, $21. This is one of the cheapest stocks out there. Their PE ratio is 7. It was like 5. Why is their PE ratio so low? Why is it you only have to pay $159 for a firm that's making $21? You only have to pay, you look at other firms, they're trading at a 30, 40 PE, and they're trading at 7 PE. What does the market know about mRNA? What do they need here to keep that earnings up? They need another pandemic. Right? Are we going to get another pandemic? How many of your friends are getting the vaccine boosters? I bet young people are not doing it. Your grandparents might, your great grandparents might, but how much can they get? I mean, that's really good, isn't it? That's just incredible. It went from negative $2 to positive $30 all in 1 year. But there's a reason for that. Can you use $21.26 to value this firm? Probably not. Probably not going to make sense at all. So you do have to be real careful. So some of your firms, you may need to do pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. So I'll give you some examples of that, but just look at history. That doesn't mean you're just going to extrapolate. Say, hey, they've been growing at 7%, so I think they're going to grow at 7%. So think about it. Also look at that growth. Has it been consistent or has it been lumpy? If it was lumpy, why was it lumpy? I mean, Exxon's another good example. Exxon had a horrible 2020. Valero had a horrible 2020. And they had a great 2022. Well, which of those is the right number? And the answer is they're both right. It's a very cyclical business. So how are you going to forecast that going forward? It's a tough business to forecast. I mean, what do you do with Valero? You're going to have them going out of business over the next 50 years? Are they going to find something new to do? It's tough value firms, isn't it? All right, the second approach is figure out what does the market think. And here the market will tell you in a particular number called the PEG ratio. The PEG ratio is the PE ratio of the firm divided by what they expect growth to be. So you use the forward PE over the next 5 years growth in earnings. I forgot to put that here, but it is the forward PE. You use the forward PE. So the PEG ratio equals the PE ratio divided by expected growth. So expected growth then is just your PE ratio divided by the PEG. And we'll do some examples of that as well to get some practice with it. Now that's the market's forecast, and I don't know whose forecast that is. I don't know exactly whose forecast they're getting to do the PEG ratio. I know there's an official source, probably Reuters or Thompson or somebody. You don't have to use this approach though. You can go to the Bloomberg machine and type EE, which means earnings estimates, and Bloomberg will tell you what the market is expecting. And the nice thing about Bloomberg is they'll give you an earnings forecast, they'll give you a revenue forecast, they'll give you EBITDA forecast, they'll give you all kinds of forecasts. So, and they'll go out 5 years. You can make sure you change it to annual instead of quarterly, but when you do that, you'll see. So Bloomberg will give you, so you can add that to your paper. You could do the PEG ratio, but you can also do that and just see how the numbers look. That's the thing that worries me about Costco. When I go to Bloomberg for Costco, you know, to me, Costco just, they made it really well because of COVID. And yet Bloomberg has them growing really fast going forward. I'm thinking, how are they going to, you know, they had a big jump in growth and then they're going to keep growing really fast. I don't see how they're going to do that. That doesn't make sense to me. So it just seems really, really aggressive. But you can put this into your paper now. You can disagree with it. You can say, hey, the growth implied for my company from the PEG ratio is 7.3%. Bloomberg shows them growing at 8%. I just don't believe those numbers. That actually is more powerful for your boss than just using your own number, ignoring those. What your boss really wants to hear you say is, the market thinks this, but I think they're wrong because. That's the most powerful thing you can do in evaluation of a company. As long as you have a good, solid answer for why you think the market's wrong, that's when your boss gets excited. Because if the market's always right, there's nothing to buy. Everything is perfectly valued. So what you're trying to convince your boss of is, you know, something that the market's got wrong, and that's when you have an opportunity to make some money. All right. So you don't have to use these numbers as your actual growth rate. That's what most students do. It's kind of boring to me. Market thinks they're going to grow 7%, so I think they're going to grow 7%. So why am I paying you $700,000 a year? Why don't I just hire the market? They're free. I got it. I'm already paying for them. But it does give you some insight on what the market thinks, especially if the historical growth is 8 or 9%, and the market's expecting negative 40%, like an mRNA. Then you know, okay, the market's telling me something. I may disagree with them, but the market's definitely telling me something. And then the last one is the academic approach. And this is what we call sustainable growth. It's an easy formula. So what sustainable growth says is, a firm has earnings. If they pay all that earnings out as dividends, they just can't grow because they're not reinvesting in the firm. If they retain all of it, they can grow faster because they're building more stores, they're adding more, you know, capabilities. And so what they're saying here is, you got to look at the retention of this firm. Higher retention means higher growth. And so what the sustainable growth says is, the firm can grow going forward the return on equity times how much they retain. So if they retain 0, they pay it all out in dividends, how fast can they grow? If your retention is 0, you can't grow. That's what this is arguing. Now, I'm going to argue against that here in a little bit, but that's how fast you can grow. So the payout ratio is your dividends divided by your earnings. Your retention is 1 minus the payout. Sustainable growth. And there's one huge problem with this. You can easily go get the ROE and the payout for your firm. In fact, I can even show it to you. I don't think Moderna would be a good one to do. Let's do Walmart. No, Walmart's not a good one to do. Let's do Costco. So you go to statistics. There's the return on equity. And there's their payout ratio. Pretty easy, isn't it? What's their retention? If their payout's 26%, how much do they retain? 74%. So what's their growth rate? 28% times 74%. That sounds like a really high number, doesn't it? So what would you need to do? Well, one thing with Costco is that this payout ratio is incredibly unstable. So go look at their dividends. So click on historical data, click on dividends, do max. And you'll notice their dividends, and look right there, paid a $10 dividend all at once. It's definitely going to reduce their ability to grow. If a firm is buying their stock back, that's going to reduce. So it's not, you have to be careful. You can't just look at that payout ratio if it's really unstable or if they're buying their stock back. All right. a special one-time dividend, the way and Costco does this a lot. There's another one. I don't know why. I think they like these special dividends versus buying their stock back for some reason. You can't ignore that. That's definitely going to reduce their growth rate because that's money they can't build stores with. Or if they're buying their stock back. So you have to be careful with that. The other thing you have to be careful of is this number. So what you want to be looking for is what we call the normalized number. So if this number was 10%, 28%, negative 4%, 12%, you want to find what is the normal number. You may take the average of the last few years or the median of the last few years. If the last year was incredibly unusual, then you don't want to use that to value the firm. All right. So we'll talk some about that. I'll give you some examples of that so you can see how that works. So you really want to do this on a normalized basis. All right. So paper 3, your goal is to get your discount rate. We'll talk through that. Paper 4, your hardest thing to do is get this growth rate. So I've given you some examples of how to do that. 3 approaches. Approach number 4 is your opinion. Is what do you think? Is this a business that really is going to take off? What demographic is it doing? So Meta is a good example. Meta's got VR, it's got all these other things going on. Do you think that's going to work? That's your opinion. So you can stick your opinion in there. All right. Papers 3 and 4, I have an entire video that walks you through that for Walmart, but we're going to do it in class as well. But we're going to practice on this. I want to make sure papers 3 and 4 is a great paper to put on LinkedIn. So I want you to have a really good paper because it's the kind of stuff you do in a job right out of college. So, all right, we'll start there next time. Let's just refresh because this is something you should be able to do in your sleep. If we did our guess, I'm going to guess duration. Usually 2-year bonds have a duration around 1.9, so I'll do that. So minus duration times the change in yield. It started off at 6%. It ended up, well, let's get our yield. So the coupon is 6%. The current yield, the risk-free rate, what was that? 272. Does that sound right? It's a 2-year bond, 2-year treasury. The spread, triple B minus or triple B plus, 2 years, that's 85. 85 divided by 10,000. Add those two together. Y'all get 357 as your yield. Does that sound familiar? And then we do the effective. $360. And so our guess is going to be minus 1.9 times 357 minus 6%. So we expect this bond to be up about 4%. So actually, Adrian, your number looked closer than y'all were up. Some of y'all were up like 10%. We'll see. $1,000 times 1 plus that. Is that right, or did I make a mistake? Because 2 teams had 1,100. So we'll see. Let's do the Bill Gates approach. Minus present value 3.57%. Number of periods is 4, right? The payment is 30. And the future value is $1,000. Ooh, I did something wrong. What did I do wrong there? $357. Oh, 357 divided by 2. Sorry. 1,046 sounds pretty good. Now we'll do the sweet approach. 30 divided by 357 divided by 2 plus 1,000 minus 30 divided by 357 divided by 2. All of that divided by 1 plus 357 divided by 2 raised to the 4. Ooh, we got it the first try. Yeah, but you gave me two pieces of paper, so which do I count? What a group one, what did y'all do? The cash flow is right. Oh, y'all made a kind of a silly. Y'all forgot you forgot that you had 272 plus 85 and you came up with 85. So one simple little error there. I don't know what the other teams did. So all right. So we'll put it in the table. So we got time, cash flow, discount factor, BCF. So 0.51, 1.52, cash flow is 30, 30, 30, 1,030. I saw one team forgot to add the 1,000 at the end. Discount factor 1 divided by 1 plus the effective yield. Raise the time. Whoops. Make sure you lock in the effective yield. Discounted cash flow. So that looks like the right answer. I only saw that once. So this might be Team 7's chance to catch up, but they gave me two pieces of paper though, so I have to see how I handle that. Do y'all want me to start having like a bonus for the first team then, or is that too much stress? All right, and then my duration, I have no idea if I got the duration right, but that times that divided by that. On shorter term bonds, it's not going to be that radically off of 1.9 because it's not, there's not much to work with. So when you get out to 10 years, yeah, it makes a big difference. But so my 1.9 was a pretty good guess. So so that's your advantage on the exam. That estimate on the exam, if you use 1.9, because I'll give you a 2-year bond probably on the exam. That 1.9 is pretty good. When you get to a 10-year bond, yeah, you can be between 8.5 and 9.5 or whatever, depending on where rates are. So if I use the actual 1.92, yeah, it's pretty close. So here's a student to Abbott Lab. So he started off with an abstract defining who the company is. That's not a bad thing to do. Says Abbott Lab does this. You can summarize it. You can get that out of Yahoo Finance or a lot of different places. He then said, a little bit about how the stock is done, a little bit of discussion. So a little bit of background on the companies. Then he comes in, adjusted earnings per share of $1.15 beat expectations by 22% from an estimated 94 cents. So in one sentence, he's got 3 of the numbers. So there's 3 numbers right there. So then he's got to talk about how it did versus last year. Did do better than expected. Q3 EPS decreased 17% in comparison to last year's. You don't necessarily have to put last year's, but you can if you want to. Make sure you consistently use 2 decimal places. So you certainly can. The one thing I'm not even letting you do if you use the Excel file, because students would do it, and you would never do this in real life, is to talk about last year's estimate. So no one cares what last year's estimate is. So I didn't, you notice I took it completely out of the file. It's not even there. There are times where you might say, this firm has beat estimates 6 quarters in a row. I've heard people talk about that. That's kind of interesting. That probably just means management talks the numbers down so they always report good news. But we don't really care. You don't care that they beat or underperformed last year. You just want to know if they were better than last year's reported numbers. So exact same thing on revenue. Reported 10 billion revenue, which beat expectations by 7%. So you got 3 things there. You got this year's number, last year's number, and you need to put the percent. Don't make your boss have to get out a calculator and figure out what percent change it is. Put that in there. That's an important number. But decrease from the year before. Now we're talking about obviously COVID COVID is impacting. This is a pharmaceutical. So there's a COVID impact here. He's probably going to be talking about that. It's unlikely all of y'all are going to have to talk about COVID in this particular report because we're far enough along, but you might. He has a good quote because he's talking about revenues. So you can certainly put that in there. Oh, I think Abbott might have been the infant formula firm. I can't remember, but anyway. So they had a special thing come up. So he's talking about that. So you might put a quote under earnings per share or under revenue, if you want to explain it. You have to decide, are you just going to give me the numbers and then talk about them? Or are you going to talk about them as you go? Why did earnings miss? Because if you talk as you go, you're going to be repeating yourself because whatever caused earnings per share to do certain things, you're going to see the same thing in margins. He's got a little typo there in margins. No, so he's going to say my gross margin was reported at 55.9 versus 55.85. 5 basis points beat, and talks about where it was last year. Gross margins decreased by 290 basis points. Unlike previous data, EBIT margin reporting this quarter was 21%, which missed expectations to 24, decreased to 247, and how it did last time. So he does the gross and net margins. He has a section. This is not that uncommon. Give all the numbers and then talk about what's unusual going on with your company right now. What's the story? There's got to be some story. There's something unusual happen. Was it good news? Was it bad news? And then he gets into how the market react. You can see he used the actual chart I gave y'all, which is fine. He does it against Danaher and just showing that their stock fell 6%, whereas a main competitor only fell 6% when the market was only down less than 1%, and healthcare was down 1.4%. So he talks through all of that. And then he says, I think the drop can be explained with people fearing the COVID test sales will suddenly fall, and he gives some explanation there. He uses he uses the charts right, the exact same charts I gave you. You don't have to do something fancy. You don't want to. Then he did year to date. I didn't give you all year to date, so he added a year to date chart. I like year to date charts. I think that's pretty powerful because your boss probably is curious because your boss isn't going to know how every stock did. And year to date, it's a pretty good way to do it. Now here we got COVID. What a lot of people were doing is, what has this done since COVID? That's probably no longer the case, but there's a lot of people saying, instead of doing year to date, how has this looked from February 2020? What have they done? Have they come back from COVID or are they still down from COVID? But you probably don't have that. So year to date is probably good. If you're doing a tech stock, what, man, did I give you all any tech stocks? I can't remember. But obviously 2022 was a horrible year for tech stocks. So you might, maybe they're having a great 2023, but if they were down 70% in 2022, the fact that they're up 12% this year doesn't sound all that impressive. So do you include that or not? That's what you have to decide. Again, you're trying to help your boss understand what's going on with this company. And then he has a little bit more discussion about some other issues, some good quotes in there. Here is a quote from the chairman, the CEO. So this is somewhat of his concluding, and he concludes the whole thing with a quote, which is not a bad way to do it. Pretty succinct, to the point. People are asking how many pages. I never say how many pages. You should never ask your professor how many pages, because you should never ask your boss how many pages. That would be a horrible question. Hey boss, I want to know how much, I don't want to put more time into this than I have to. I really don't want to work all that hard. So is 2 pages enough? That's not a good question to ask your boss, but 3 pages isn't better than 2, 5's not better than 3, but it can be. But he got it in 2 pages with all the graphs and double column with the narrow margins. So I think it was in pretty good shape. He answered all the questions. That's the big part of how great, especially critical thinking. At the end of it, they'll understand what happened to this company. Now, obviously, I'm going to have a pretty good idea because if 80 of y'all do the same company, I'm going to get a little bit. I'm going to have it memorized. Someone asked me about that company next week after I grade these. They're going to think, wow, you really know these companies really well. I was like, no, I just read 8 papers on the same thing. So yeah, I have it in detail. All right, questions on that? You see how that works? Looks professional, doesn't it? Could he put this on LinkedIn? Be proud of it? That looks like a good piece of paper, something. This is a paper you could definitely put on LinkedIn, no question. All right. Okay, so let's finish up the stocks and then let's do an actual example. So we talked about the growth rates. You have the long-term growth rate, which is probably going to be real close to how fast you think the economy is going to grow. And then the shorter-term growth rate, we said you can look at their recent history. You can use the PEG ratio. And then we have this formula, sustainable growth, that you probably need to normalize. You probably need to look back and see if this last year is unusual. So starting here, the question is, how long will this period of higher or lower growth last? If you expect them ultimately to grow up 4%, is that in 5 years? Is that in 10 years? And then 20 years? If it's Campbell soup, it might be right now, maybe in 0 years. If it's Amazon or Google or Meta, maybe it's 10, 15, 20 years. 10 is a pretty long period of time. You might think the Intels and Microsofts, boy, they had this incredible growth. You'd be surprised. Theirs is like 15, 16 years. It's really not 20 years. And you say, yeah, but it was still 16 years. Yeah, but I just mentioned 10 companies out of 50,000 companies. It's not that normal for firms to grow at 30, 40%, especially big companies, 100 billion plus companies just don't typically grow hyper growth rates for more than a few years. It's very difficult to do. The competition comes in. Maybe a itty bitty company that has $2 million in revenue. Yeah, maybe they could grow 50, 60% for several years, but you're probably not going to do a company like that. So 10, just to tell you, 10 would be a very long time. You're getting up there into some long periods, almost unsustainable. I used to have a chart where I took all the fastest growing companies and showed their growth. And almost all of these really hyper growth companies, you see this line growing fast, and then right around year 10, the growth rate starts to trail off. That's the Microsoft, the Apples, the Amazons. And I did revenue, I didn't do income. So you're doing income, so it could be a little bit longer period for some of these companies, but you're probably not going to use 20 years. So your long-term growth rate, terminal growth rate, for most, is going to be tied to the economy. Now, what models are we going to use? Let's look at the models before we do the discount rate. So there's 3 models I want you to use, and then there's 3 models on the exam itself, and then your team case. So the dividend discount model. What I call the capitalized earnings model. And then the H model. I can't remember what we did last class in these, but I get my 2 classes mixed up. Have we covered these models yet? I don't think we have. We haven't gotten into them yet. So, all right. Dividend discount model, you had that in a previous class, in your 3013 class. So you've seen this one before. So it's a perpetual growth model, just like I was doing with that bond. $30 divided by the discount rate, that infinity, that's what the dividend discount model is. It takes next year's dividend divided by the discount rate, but then it subtracts growth. So remember when I did the $30 divided by the rate, I just did the $30 divided by the rate with no growth. But here, you're not going to get the same dividend like with that bond. You don't get $30 every 6 months forever and ever and ever. That dividend is going to grow at a growth rate. So this is called a perpetual growth annuity. It's also known as a dividend discount model. And I don't know who Gordon is and why he got this named after him, because it's a pretty basic math equation. So, but it's next year's dividend. I can't remember what dividend I give you, but you see when we do. If I give you last year's dividend, you need to forecast next year's dividend by taking dividend 0 times 1 plus your growth rate. If I give you next year's dividend as a forecast, you just use next year's dividends. So last year's dividends, the last 12 months. On paper 4, what you're going to do, and I'll just show it to you. It's pretty straightforward. So I'll do Walmart. I think, boy, I cannot remember what I've done in this class or some other ones were almost at the exact same spot. So if I'm showing you stuff I showed you before, give me for that. So I'm going to do max here, and I'm going to do dividends only. So the number you want to use is dividend 0, which is last year, is just the last year's of dividends. Walmart's very straightforward because they pay dividends quarterly, so you just add up the last 4. So be careful, you can't always add the last 4 because sometimes they don't pay quarterly. So look at the dates, but we can see March, December, August, May. The previous one's March, so you do the last 4 dividends. So for paper 4, your dividend 0 is you're just going to go on and catch those numbers. You have to do that because on the summary page, for some reason, someone at Yahoo Finance decided to do this thing called the forward dividend. Just a nonsensical number. So what they mean by the forward dividend is they take the last quarter's dividend and multiply by 4. But that's not the right answer. You don't want that. So don't use this number. You can use this earnings per share number. You notice what it says right there. TTM, what is that? Trailing 12 months. So that earnings per share is fine. I wish they would do this. They used to do that here. This dividend used to be trailing 12 months. And for someone had a great idea of using what they call the forward dividend, which is not actually even the right answer. It's not a forward dividend. So all they're doing, so they're taking this 57 cents times 4, and that's how they get that 228. But with Walmart, you want to add up the last 4 because you're probably this next year going to get not 228, you're probably going to get 57 times 3 plus 58 because you can see Walmart's fairly predictable in their dividends, aren't they? I don't know if there's a company more predictable than Walmart on their dividends. They've gone up a penny in the last 10 years. They've gone up a penny every quarter. I mean, every year is the same, and then the next year they add a penny. So they've gone up 4 cents the last several years. So it's pretty predictable. Some companies are wild. So Costco, I think I've shown you theirs before. So their dividends are pretty unpredictable. And then they do this at $10, which is just bizarre. So I don't know what you do with that. If I were doing a Costco, I would probably maybe take that $10 and maybe spread it over the years or something, but it's just a bizarre number. And then other companies, like if you do Google, they don't pay dividends. So can you do a Google? You can. If you want to do Alphabet or Google, you can, but we're not going to use dividends. So let's talk about this theory because this is really, really important. There's a huge assumption in this model that we need to take in consideration. We're using dividends as a proxy for something else. And they want to guess what should we really be using here that we're not? Any guesses? What did you learn in your other finance class? Huh? Free cash flow, right? Did I already do that in this class? No. All right, so free cash flow. So the dividend discount model is assuming the dividends approximate free cash flows. But for most companies, that's not true. I like how Damodaran says that's not true for 95% of the companies out there. So for 5% of the companies, their dividend they're paying is probably pretty close to their free cash flow. Which means what you can do with these models is instead of using dividends, you can use free cash flow per share or equity. That's a number I can give you. It's a number you can get out of the Bloomberg machine. But how do you calculate it? And there's so many different ways to calculate it. I use a really simple calculation that's pretty easy to get. But you can get a you can use free cash flow per share. So you can do alphabet. So the thing with alphabet, if you want to do alphabet, you'll have to get that free cash flow per share before you value them, and then use that as your valuation. Use a substitute it for dividends, and it works perfectly fine. And in fact, it is probably the better answer, because free cash flow is really what we're after. So free cash flow, if the firm has free cash flow, they might pay dividends, but they might buy their stock back, or they might reinvest in the firm. That's what you do with free cash flow. If a firm's paying a dividend and it is their free cash flow, it probably just means they've run out of growth opportunities and they're just sending all their cash back to their investors. And that makes it a pretty easy firm to value. The problem with the free cash flow is the calculation. So it is really, really tough. There are formulas for free cash flow, but I don't believe any of them. Because it's free cash flow is not a number you can go quickly calculate somewhere. That's what Bloomberg does for you. If you take some of these classes, they'll show you, you probably have had a free cash flow formula. You can read my free cash flow blog to see why I think it's not such an easy number. So free cash flow is a fairly subjective number that probably is going to be calculated differently by each company that you use. But there are some approximations of free cash flow that are probably better than dividends as far as for most companies, as far as figuring out their valuation. Another thing real important, I always have at least 2 students, maybe 3 or 4 on paper 4 make this mistake. Your growth rate must be lower than your discount rate. It has to be. I don't mean for this class. I mean for every class that's ever been offered in the history of finance, the growth rate must be lower than your discount rate. Now, if the growth rate's higher, you will get a negative number, but that's not the value of the stock. The growth rate's higher, the value you get is infinity. Because what that means is your dividends are growing faster than your discounted cash flows. I'm sorry, your discounted cash flows, the present value of your dividends is a growing number. So if you have a number that's always getting larger, it's infinity. But if your growth rate's less than your K, and I can even show you mathematically, let's just do it. It's pretty easy to do this mathematically. We can do Walmart. So Walmart's dividend is what, 0.57 times 3 plus 0.56, 227. Let's say growth, I'll give them 4.5%. Discount rate, risk-free rate. Wow, we're down to 3.2%, are we? What's going on with interest rates? My word, it's getting crazy. Market risk premium, we'll talk about this. I'll use 4.8%. Beta, what beta we use for Walmart? Let's try 0.6. Our discount rate. And you don't show betas as percents. Risk-free rate plus beta times market risk premium. So if we have time in here, year 1, year 2, when will Walmart go out of business? Let's say in 2,000 years or 1,900 years. What's their first dividend? Their first dividend is 227 times 1 plus their growth rate. Their second dividend is that times 1 plus their growth rate. We just copy that down all the way down. I copied the wrong one. So we're just growing their dividends every year all the way down. In 2,000 years, their dividend will be 5 with 36 zeros after. And that dividend will buy you, I don't know, a few loaves of bread. So it's going to be a lot of money because of, just the compounding. And we take the present value of that. So that divided by 1 plus our discount rate raised to the time. What do you notice about these discounted cash flows? Getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Why are they getting smaller? Because 6.08 is greater than 4.5. And you go out 1900 years, how much is it? What's the present value there? Well, it's 0.0000. It has almost no impact on the value whatsoever because it's gotten really, really small. And so what's the value? The value is just the sum of those discounted cash flows. So we get 150, or the value is dividend 1 divided by KE minus growth. So it's the same either way. Which would you rather do? This is a lot of work, isn't it? Have to have all these lines. So this formula is just a substitution for that formula. How much of that valuation just in the first 25 years? Because that's a long time, isn't it? 25 years. And that's not even a third of their value. So when you're valuing Walmart, you don't have to have a forecast for 5 years. You don't need a good forecast for 25 years. Let's go out 50 years. You're just over half their value is over 50 years. So your forecast has got to be good. What about 100 years? You would think if you could accurately forecast the next 100 years, you'd be a pretty good investor and you'd still have another 30% of the value to go. So a third of Walmart's value, maybe not quite a third, but about a fourth of their value is after 100 years from now. How many of y'all feel comfortable describing Walmart to me in 23 years? Any of y'all have that down? Well, you got to get it right in 100 years. Because if you don't get it right in 100 years, your valuation will be off 25, 30%. It's really hard to value stocks. Do you think Walmart will even be in business in 20 years? I hope they're out of business. I hope Alphabet's out of business. I want all these companies out of business. I want some new person coming in and having such a great product, they go out of business. That's what I want. Walmart may not want that, but it's definitely what I want. So you have to be really, really accurate on these forecasts. What happens though if my growth rate is 6.5%? What value do I get? Well, the dividend discount model gives me a negative number. The sum of the discounted cash flow gives me a large number. Which of those is correct? And the answer is no, neither one. Because what's happening to my present values now? They're getting larger. How many years do I have to go out before the present value goes to 0? There is no number of years. So what's the value of Walmart if their growth rate is greater than discount rate? It's infinity. Right? And there's no solution for that. There's nothing I can give you to solve that. So make sure I've had students give me a valuation for their company of negative $1,400 and it doesn't phase them in the bit. Does that seem strange to you? Is that a student too much in the weeds? If you get a negative number for a value for a company, should you just keep writing your paper? Does that make sense? Shouldn't that stop you in your tracks? I mean, there's something going wrong, right? There's someone who's just way in too much into the weeds. So every once in a while, stop back and think, what am I doing here? Oh, is Walmart really worth negative $1,400? If someone walked up to you and said, hey, I got Walmart stock, I think it's worth negative $1,400, but I'll give you $1,300 and the stock and I'll come out ahead. Would you take it? Would you take $1,300 in their Walmart stock? I would. I think that'd be a great. But do you think anyone believes Walmart stock is worth negative $1,400? What's the least it's worth? 0, right? So that value makes no sense. But someone in this class will do that because it's just like, put your head down and go. But always step back and think about the valuation. So what's their actual stock price? $149.67. So what would be my recommendation on Walmart? Buy, hold, sell. Huh? A buy? Current price? I would probably put a hold. Because that's not much upside, is it? I mean, it's essentially well valued. Right? There's no reason to have a strong buy or no reason to have a sell because they're well valued. So Walmart is a fairly easy stock to value. So that's why you get such a close number. I'm not going to suggest though that their dividends do match their free cash flow. In this case, it seems to work well. That may just be pure random chance. Right, so that's the first model. The biggest problem with this model, well, there's two big problems. One, do dividends really reflect free cash flow? Now you can't have a stock, and just to let you know, you can have a stock that pays dividends and you still use free cash flow per share. So Apple's a good example. Apple's paying a dividend, but their dividend obviously doesn't match their free cash flow. Their dividend is so puny relative to their free cash flow. You're going to get a really low valuation for Apple if you use their dividends. So that's the company you probably are better off using their free cash flow per share. So that's the first problem, is using dividends, but you can fix that by using free cash flow per share. The second problem is we only have one growth rate. This is called the constant growth dividend discount model. You only have one growth rate. And so if you only have one growth rate, you got a firm that's growing really fast, you got to somehow figure out how to adjust that. If they're growing 10% right now, but ultimately you're going to play 4, you can't use 10 because then your growth rate would be greater than your discount rate. But you got to figure out 10% today, but 5% for hundreds of years. What does that come out to? Maybe it's 5.2, maybe it's 5.3. You can mathematically figure that out in Excel if you wanted to try it, but you only have one growth rate. So the alternative to that then is what we call the H model. I love the H model. Very simple model. I'd never heard of it in college, and then when I did the CFA exam, it was in the footnotes of that exam. So I started using it. I love it a lot. If you notice, the first part of it and the last part of it is exactly the same as the dividend discount model. Dividend 0 times 1 plus growth, or dividend 1 divided by KE minus growth. All we're doing is we're adding this middle section, dividend 0 times H times short-term growth minus long-term growth. So I do give you dividend 0 because the H model uses dividend 0. So I now remember what I give you on the exam. So this middle part is adding in an unusual growth period. So you have the long-term growth. That number is probably going to be pretty close to what you think economic growth is going to be. You have short-term growth, which is where you think they are right now. That's where that PEG ratio or recent history is going to help you give you that short-term growth. And you're going to take dividend 0 times some number H times the short-term growth minus long-term growth. You're going to add that to the denominator. Make sure you know it's in the denominator. Numerator. Make sure you know it's in the numerator. This whole thing. I have some students that do dividend 0 times 1 plus growth plus, and then they do all of this divided by KE. They forget to divide this by KE minus growth. So make sure the entire numerator is one number before you do the denominator. So what is this H? The H stands for half-life. So you're asking how many years it's going to take you to get from short-term growth to long-term growth. If that's 10, then take half of it and use 5. So the H is that half-life. I've had engineering students say, we use a formula exactly like that in engineering. So there's like this exists in nature. Very simple formula, but powerful because it gives you the ability to use multiple growth rates. And this is where I was talking about that 10 years. 10 years is a long time for a firm to have high growth rates. So that means an H of 5 would be a pretty high number. So if your H is going to be higher than 5, you've got a company you think is something really unusual is going on. You have great confidence in those companies. I would suggest any company with a market cap over 100 billion, I would definitely not use an H more than 5. If you've got a company that's a small $2 billion, $10 billion company, maybe you could have a longer H, but unlikely. We were talking today at lunch. one of the stocks, I'm mentoring this high school student who wants to work in finance. And he's looking at the company that's doing the, I think we talked about this earlier, the drug for obesity. That people think, is it a shot?
Yeah.
What's it called? Okay, yeah, that's what he said it was. I can't remember. That's a company that could grow pretty fast for quite some time. But you have a huge advantage with that company in something called a patent. Things change when that patent runs out. So, if you do a firm like that, not only do you know you're gonna have high growth, but you also know when that growth may start settling down, because when that patent goes off and the generics come in, you've got a pretty good idea that the growth rate is going to drop. It may not drop to the long term. The challenge with a firm like that is they may develop other drugs as well. So a lot of students struggle. This is probably 70% of students get almost no value on the H. You have to figure out some way to rationalize that. I've had students ask, where do I go to get the H? And you don't go anywhere. You go to your mind. It's entirely a subjective forecast that you got to get. There's absolutely no place. But I mentioned that firm because if you have something like that, like a patent coming offline or whatever, that can give you some basis. But I don't know. But you have to give some rationale. So it's creative writing. Why do you think it's going to be 10 years or 5 years or whatever? So it can be pretty tough. But I'm giving you some hint that if it's greater than 5 on your H, if your H is greater than 5, you're being pretty aggressive. So it had to be a firm like that. That drug firm has something where, there's a lot of people that could use the drug. It's an expensive drug. And as I mentioned, I think in a previous class, if you stop using it, it stops working, which is horrible for healthcare and wonderful for pharmaceuticals. You can't get a better drug than that. So find some basis. Now, this might influence your decision on what company to pick. You might pick a company that you come up with the best story for how you came up with their age and their short-term growth. But I've given you some tools for at least giving some ballpark of what the short-term growth would be. So the PEG ratio, recent history, and the sustainable growth model. Not that you have to use those numbers, but at least gives you some ballpark figures. I love it. It's a great model. A lot simpler than other models like this one. If you ever have a professor give you this model, just refuse. So this is called the multi-stage growth model. Ridiculous model, far too complicated. I had one professor, I don't know if I told you, I had one professor, we had to memorize this for the exam, but he didn't tell us to memorize it for the exam. But I figured out that he was going to have us, I was the only student on that exam that had memorized this formula. The rest of the class came out, they were so irately mad. But it's a ridiculous formula for multiple growth. And what this formula assumes is that you're going to grow like 12% for 7 years, and then suddenly you're going to drop down to 8% for 3 years, and you got to take each one of those periods. I prefer the H model. What the H model says is you're going to start growing at 12%, you're ultimately going to grow at 5%, and you're going to glide from 12 down to 5. That seems like a reasonable assumption to me. That doesn't seem all that outlandish at all. So I like the H model. I don't know why people say, well, they're going to grow 12% for exactly 4 years and then suddenly start growing 10. That just seems, why would they think that? Obviously, it's not going to be exactly 12. So there's the H model. This last model, this is my own model, although I've heard Dr. Damer talking about it, not specifically to me, but he's had students ask about a model like this. He doesn't like it. I don't like it that he doesn't like it because he's a lot smarter than I am. But I also don't like the reason he doesn't like mine because I think he's wrong. But who am I to say Damer would ever be wrong? But I call it the capitalized earnings model. Some students mix it up with CAPM and they call it the CAPM model. This is not, I did not come up with the CAPM model. That's someone also much smarter than I am who won a Nobel Prize for that. I haven't won any Nobel Prizes. I don't think I've even won many prizes in my life. I think in second grade, I think for swimming or something. But all right, so the capitalized earnings model, my idea here is what's the value of this firm as is, adding nothing. So what's the value of Walmart that didn't build another store ever again in the rest of their history? So I'm trying to figure out the existing business as is. And so what I'm going to assume is they're going to pay out 100% of their earnings. They're going to retain zero. And that implies that their earnings can only grow at 0%. But I'm going to say that earnings can actually grow with inflation. This is where David Darren disagrees with me. He says, if you pay it all out, your earnings growth is zero. But if a firm pays out all their earnings, they can keep raising their prices with inflation. Their expenses go up with inflation. If your revenues go up with inflation, your expenses go up with inflation, your income goes up with inflation. Now you might say, well, the firm like Walmart, don't they have to fix some of their stores? Don't they have some stuff that's going to cut? And I say, yeah, that's true. But earnings per share is not cash. Earnings per share is actually less than cash because of depreciation. They have some non-cash things. So they do have some cash over and above earnings per share that they can use to refurbish. So I like it. It's, to me, a simpler model than, and some of y'all probably have heard this model. Tobin's Q, if y'all remember that model? Did y'all have Tobin's Q in any of your classes? So there's a lady who worked for me. She married a guy named Tobin, and I kind of was making fun of her last name. I don't think he was related to the Tobin here, but what Tobin's Q is trying to figure out is, it's kind of an interesting concept, is if I were to create Walmart from scratch with nothing, no buildings, no land, nothing, no inventory, how much would it cost me to build Walmart from scratch? So it's kind of the replacement value of Walmart, and then you compare that to Walmart's valuation. So James Tobin invented it in 1966. It takes the market value of the firm over how much it would cost you to create that firm from scratch. You're probably thinking, how in the world would I figure that out? And yeah, exactly. How would you figure out creating Google or Alphabet from scratch? It would be a really hard exercise to do. So this is a very theoretical, very, very difficult model to come up with. My model is a lot simpler than that. And essentially, I just say, hey, let's take what they're currently doing, assume they pay out all their earnings as cash, they can only grow with inflation, we can value them. So they can't, if they pay out all their earnings in cash, they can't build new stores. So that's off the table. So they're just stuck with the stores they have. What is that worth? So you would hope that this value would be less than the current market value. But occasionally you'll find firms where this value is actually greater than the current value. And those are pretty interesting firms. To me, the most interesting one was in 2008. I ran this model, Apple. Apple was trading below this number. And that's when I thought, wow, Apple looks really cheap. Maybe I should put my entire net worth into Apple. I didn't, because I was retiring in 3 months. So, but, or 5, 6 months. But yeah, you would not expect Apple to trade below this value, but you will find firms like a Kroger's or like a Campbell Soup that can actually trade below this value. Or Macy's would be a good example. So Macy's trade below this value. Why? Because the market's expecting Macy's to shut more stores down. And so they're actually not going to be able to sustain what they're currently doing. They're going to be shutting down and getting smaller. So to me, it's interesting. What I really like to do with this model, I like to do it against a bunch of companies, like tech companies especially. And I want to know which tech companies have most of their valuation and stuff they haven't even started doing yet. So if a firm's current valuation is 30%, what they're currently doing is 30% and 70%, that tells me something versus one that's 5% versus 95%. So it gets back to what Darren said back up here. Oh, I think I took that chart out, but what he said. Y'all remember this? So essentially what I'm saying is my model is trying to figure out just this one piece. Y'all remember that? Just the existing business. How much is that worth? If this is worth more than the firm, then they're saying this value of growth is actually a negative number, that they're actually going to be shrinking their business. That's probably true of Sears and Kmart, I would guess. They're shrinking their business. But I'm also curious what percentage this is of the total value, because if it's really small, if it's only 5%, I'm betting a lot on their management expanding the company correctly and doing the right new things going forward, adding in the right number of stores, adding the right number of products. So I'm a little nervous of firms where this part of the business is a small fraction of the overall valuations. Can management really get that right going forward? So it makes me a little bit nervous. All right. So if you look at the model for that, then it looks a lot like the dividend discount model, except for instead of using dividends, we use earnings. And instead of using the growth rate, we use inflation, but everything else is the same. So you just substitute earnings for dividends and you substitute inflation for the growth rate. And that's my simplified, very simplified model. And your earnings per share 1 is going to be earnings per share 0 times 1 plus the inflation rate. You put everything with inflation. All right, so on paper 4, take note of this. You can use the dividend discount model on paper 4 and not explain it because everybody knows that model. The H model, you maybe can get away with that. It's not as well known, but you can't just say the valuation I gave with the capitalized earnings model is X because no one's going to know what that is, right? I made up this term. So you have to give some explanation for capitalized earnings model is a model used in a class with a professor at UTSA. And what he argued is, and you have to give a little explanation in using that, all right? So you can't just use a term that no one knows. You have to give some explanation on it. I think even the H model, you have to do a little explanation. I would at least maybe even show the formula so people know. It's a little better known. I don't know who created the H model. So those are the 3 models that you need to use on your paper, and they'll be on the exam as well. The dividend discount model, the capitalized earnings model, and the H model. H model is my favorite. You can do what's called proprietary quantitative model. I really don't recommend this one anymore, but essentially, I might show it to y'all next class. We'll see. Essentially what it is, if you got a firm that's not paying any dividends, you forecast their earnings growth at high growth rates, but then you assume that growth rate is going to fall over time and eventually get to some normal growth rate. So what my model assumes is they pay no dividends until their growth rate hits that long-term growth rate. So if they're growing at 20% now and they're ultimately going to grow 5%, the model says as soon as they start growing at 5%, I want them to pay half of their earnings out as dividends. And then it just values those dividends. So it's essentially the H model, but the H model with 0 dividends until you hit that long-term growth. But your dividends are growing because your earnings per share is growing at a high rate. So it's a fairly simple model. I might show it to you, but I actually think you're better off using the H model, but using free cash flow per share than doing this. I think it's actually a better model, but you can do this. I can show it to you. It is great to be able to use these terms in an interview. Say, I built a proprietary quantitative model, a proprietary quantitative valuation model. That sounds even better, especially if you're talking to the HR people, because everything sounds impressive to them, right? They've been studying HR. Anything finance is going to sound impressive, just like they can probably wire you with HR terms. So yeah, be careful when you're talking to finance people because they might ask you some questions you don't want to answer. But proprietary, what does that mean? You built it. Quantitative, what does that mean? You got at least one formula in it. Model means what? Whatever you want it to mean. Model is a pretty industry term. So yeah, proprietary quantitative model. So you could use something like that, but I still prefer just use free cash flow per share. I might next class show you that. There are free cash flow models. I don't want you to use them in this class, but the traditional one, and if you look at investment banking models, this is the one they do. They do free cash flow from the firm, and then divide that by the cost of capital, not by the KE, by the cost of capital minus growth. That gives them the value of the firm. You then subtract the debt out, and you got the value of the stock. If you take Katapakham's class, he'll definitely use this model. You'll see it a lot. It's pretty common. Almost any time you look at an investment bank valuation model, it's almost exactly like this. I don't know, Dante, you see this model in your interns? Did you do valuation in your intern? You usually see it as 5 years of free cash flow. You present value that, and you do the terminal free cash flow. You present value that. That's the most. And I don't know why it's 5. It's always 5 years, but it's for some reason it's 5 years. Pretty common. If you interview with an investment bank You definitely want to learn that. We were talking last night in the investment society class. There's something called a pitch book. And pitch books, there's two types. There's an investment banking pitch book, and then there's the portfolio management. But the investment banking pitch book, there's plenty of YouTube videos out there showing you how to build one. And if I were going to interview with the Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan on the investment banking side, I would absolutely make sure I know what a pitch book looked like. I would actually build one myself, just using pretend numbers, so I could just, you could go to an interview and say, yeah, I created a pseudo pitch book. Here's what it looks like. And you want it, they're real picky about exactly what should be there, what it should look like. And they'll definitely use this type of model. Or you can do free cash flow to equity, which is what I'm recommending that you do. What's the difference between free cash flow to the firm and free cash flow to equity? It's so simple. It's free cash flow to the firm minus interest expense. That's how easy it is, right? The only difference between free cash flow to the firm and free cash flow to equity is interest expense. So and the free cash flow I calculate is net of interest expense. So my free cash flow is to the stockholder. If it's to the stockholder, then you just use KE minus G, just like in the dividend discount model, just like in the H model. So it's a very simple thing to do. So I'm essentially recommending that you do this approach, but put it into the Gordon growth model and the H model. So we're not going to get into free cash flow here, but I highly recommend you take Katapakham's class. That's something he goes into a lot of detail on. Another model we won't use is called contingent claims model. And I talked about this in Investment Society last week. Stocks can be viewed as an option, or stocks can be viewed as a stock plus an option. And the contingent claim says, okay, you got this company that most of their business looks like a normal stock that we're going to value using the dividend discount model, but they have this one thing that's pretty wild. It's going to cost them, maybe it's an energy company, and they've got some fields in Antarctica that they think might have oil. They're not sure, might have natural gas. They have no idea, maybe something else, cobalt or whatever, lithium. They're not sure. It's going to cost them $1 million, $10 million, whatever, to go explore it. If it's not there, they lost 10 million. If it's there, they're going to make 20 billion. All right, that's an option. Anytime you have a limited downside and your upside is massive, that's not a stock, that's an option. I was talking last Wednesday, I forgot to tell them, when you're looking at a small tech startup company, dividend discount models don't make any sense. You almost want to use an option model for those. It's just the math makes more sense. So essentially what you would do for a firm like that is you'd value the normal part of the firm, but that optional part, you would value using option pricing theory. Pharmaceuticals are a lot like that. A new drug, if it doesn't work, they spend $1 billion developing it. If it does work, they're going to make $50–60 billion. A firm like Disney or Pixar, a new movie, spend $100 million on it. They only make 80 million, 70 million, didn't work. Or it's the next Toy Story. It's the next Star Wars. Well, okay, well, then that's going to, not only is that going to be $1 billion in movie tickets, you also have all the merchandise and t-shirts and everything else. Is that possible? It doesn't come around very often, but when it comes around, boy, it's worth a lot. How do you value that? You can't value that using dividend discount models. It just doesn't make any sense. We don't cover this undergraduate, but if you want to learn how to do this, Emma Darren's graduate course is online, and he actually goes in detail how to do it. The math is pretty tough because the inputs are really hard to get, but you can do that. It does exist. So those are the main models that you use. The most popular one, especially for investment banking, is the one I was talking about here, a free cash flow to the firm type of model. The disadvantage is you have to have the WACC, and to get the WACC, you have to get the cost of debt. And I don't want us messing with cost of debt and cost of equity and all that. It's just too much extra work for this class. All right. So what I'm going to do next class is I'm going to walk through the entire paper 3 and 4 on Walmart. And then you also have a video where I do that as well. You have to be careful. The video I did was a few years ago. And I'm discussing issues like what do you do when the 10-year treasury is so low? Well, it's not so low anymore. So there's some issues that don't exist anymore. But I'm gonna walk it through. So make sure you're paying close attention. You might actually even have your company picked so you can start thinking about your company specifically as you walk through it.